Now, today we are pleased to have Heather Hodges with us to speak on Gullah Geechee heritage and Lowcountry cultural landscapes. Ms. Hodges became the executive director of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Natural Heritage Area in November 2017. During her tenure, she has placed an emphasis on developing educational programs, supporting cultural documentation and historic preservation efforts, encouraging heritage tourism, and fostering new research. She's a frequent speaker and author on the issue of impacts of environmental change and development on Gullah Geechee communities, their built heritage, and challenges to preserving land ownership. She has addressed groups ranging from the National Trust for Historic Preservation to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In the chat, you're going to find a link to her recent article, The Gullah Geechee, Reflections on the Warp and Weft of Cultural Tradition and Landscape, which was commissioned by the Network for Landscape Conservation. Ms. Hodges graduated with honors from the Tulane University School of Law and has done graduate studies at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as postgraduate fellowship at Georgetown University School of Law. She sits on the board of directors of the South Carolina Aquarium, the advisory boards of South Carolina Sea Grant, and the Charles Joyner Institute for Gullah Geechee and African Diaspora Studies at Coastal Carolina University. She's a member of St. Patrick's Catholic Church in downtown Charleston and a supporter of the Charleston Area Justice Ministry, a social justice advocacy network of faith-based congregations. Heather, welcome to Little Lunch Lecture.
Sorry, I was muted too. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for joining me for lunch today. I'm just going to share my screen now and tell you as quickly as I can, as much as I can about the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. Now, y'all heard I was a lawyer, so it's going to be a challenge for me to stick to the brief of 20 minutes. So if Laura or Van, if you could just give me like a 5-minute when I'm close to that, and I'll wrap it up. Again, I'm the executive director of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. So pleased to be with y'all in North Carolina today. 3 counties of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor are represented by North Carolina, and that's Brunswick County, New Hanover, and Pender. And since I think most everyone on the phone is from North Carolina, you probably recognize this remarkable painting. This is by the acclaimed artist Ivy Hayes. And we use his artwork often to help us convey the richness of the Gullah Geechee heritage of Eastern North Carolina. Before I talk about our work and talking with Van, we thought it might be helpful to give you a little context for what we are. While many people have heard of the corridor, not many people realize we are a National Heritage Area, or what the Federal National Heritage Area program is. It's a program that's administered by the United States National Park Service. And National Heritage Areas are landscapes that are created and designated by an act of Congress in recognition of the fact that they have a collection of natural, cultural, and historic resources that combined form a cohesive, nationally important landscape. And using resources from the federal government as well as private philanthropy, we work to tell and share these nationally important stories that celebrate our nation's diverse heritage. So what you see on your screen is the Rails to Trails Festival that we have every December in the rural farming community of Armstrong, Florida. That's an historic Gullah Geechee farming community. Potatoes, for the most part, supplied a lot of produce to St. Augustine before interstate trucking took over. And they have a very rich story that's rooted in their particular cultural landscape and program a heritage festival around it. And that's an example of the way that we collaborate with communities locally to figure out what are those stories that are important, what's the history, the local culture that our Gullah Geechee communities want to share, and how do we partner with them to share those stories with the world. If you want to know generally more about the National Heritage Area program, the National Park Service has a website, and there are actually 55 of them in the country. So as you travel across the United States, we encourage you to visit other National Heritage Areas that tell other stories. So for example, the Motor Cities NHA tells a story of our country's fantastic automotive history. So across the 55, it's important to note, though, that only one has a group of people as its subject, and that's the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. And the story that we tell, the story that's rooted in this particular landscape, is very much about the movement of a group of people from West Africa into the lower Atlantic colonies, primarily from between 1750 and 1800. Those enslaved Africans came from what was known and what is still known as the Rice Coast of West Africa. So those are countries we now know today as Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia, Liberia, and of course, Sierra Leone. And those people were very much in demand here in the Lowcountry because during that period of time, and for a period of time after it, rice agriculture was the leading form of agriculture in the lower Atlantic states. And so people from the west coast of West Africa were very much in demand by planters in the Lowcountry. Many of them during that period of 1750 and 1800 came through this place, which is the Bunce Island Slave Fort. It sits in the middle of the Sierra Leone River. And because of the number of people that came through that slave fort directly into the lower Atlantic country, we can start to tell a story about the collective and shared ancestry of the Gullah Geechee people, and about those Africans that were brought to the Lowcountry to do this, which was to completely transform the landscape of the lower Atlantic by carving out of these marshlands and wetlands rice plantations. And so if you've never seen a rice plantation from the air, we often use aerial photography to give you a sense of how vast these plantations are. Many of you may have visited them, but until you fly over them, you have no sense of what the engineering feat is that was involved in the first instance in creating these rice plantations without the use of heavy machinery, using bare hands and hand tools, and the scale of rice agriculture in this country. This is an abandoned plantation outside of Charleston, but these plantations line the lower Atlantic coast, many of them along the banks of the many mighty rivers that form a ladder down the lower Atlantic from the Cape Fear to the St. Johns River in Florida. So this is Orton Plantation around 1890 in North Carolina, and many plantations, rice plantations along the Cape Fear River. So just as we can start to tell a story about a common ancestry in the rice coast of West Africa, we can also share a story about a common lived experience on the coastal rice plantations of the lower Atlantic for those individuals. Another picture again from 1890. So a large part of what we do is to talk about the ways in which a particular group of people completely transform not just the physical landscape of the lower Atlantic, but culturally not only brought with them a significant amount of African cultural retentions, managed to preserve and retain them to the present day. And it's not all rice plantations, of course, depending where you are in the lower Atlantic. You may be more familiar with the Gullah Geechee experience with growing Sea Island cotton or indigo. But rice was the dominant form of agriculture. And so all along the lower Atlantic, you'll find these massive rice plantations. This is one on the St. Mary's River, which is north of Jacksonville. It's now part of white oak conservation. Many of these abandoned rice fields are now part of large-scale conservation projects. And what we are doing now is working with the folks who run White Oak to talk about what are the stories that they can share from that platform about the Gullah Geechee experience. And again, the primary story we tell, one that spans the corridor, is of people who were enslaved on these massive plantations, many of them coming from a single region in Africa, and being brought here because they had a very valuable set of skills. The way slavery is taught in this country, the people who were enslaved, their backstories get flattened out, right? And you don't hear this part of the story. Which is true, they don't grow a lot of rice in England. So if you are a planter, most of our planters were from England, some of them from Barbados via England, rice agriculture is not part of English agricultural heritage. It is part of West African agricultural heritage. So there was a very specific and robust market for the ancestors of the Gullah Geechee people. So that's one of the other stories we get to tell, or help tell, is a more balanced picture about the ways in which Africa formed a foundational culture, not just for the lower Atlantic coast in the South, but for the entire United States. And it's a story that that also lets us talk about the geography and topography and the landscapes of West Africa. Some of you may know that a new documentary aired here in South Carolina last night, and we'll share a link to it, that talks about a homecoming trip that a group of Gullah Geechee community members made to Sierra Leone in December. And one of the things they were most excited to see and to visit was a rice field, because that linked heritage is still strong, excuse me. So there's the shared history, the shared origin, the shared experience with agriculture. And one of the consequences of the enslavement of the ancestors of the Gullah Geechee people on these plantations, which were fairly isolated, surrounded by water, many of them. This was a very labor-intensive form of agriculture in an environment that wasn't necessarily hospitable to Europeans who lacked the will and sometimes the tolerance to deal with tropical diseases. These were lethal environments. Rice agriculture, probably after sugarcane, the second most lethal form of colonial agriculture that there was in the New World, because the ancestors of the Gullah Geechee people were fairly isolated in what we call Africanized environments. They were able to maintain and sustain a broad set of African cultural retentions that are still visible today in Gullah Geechee people's distinctive arts, crafts, foodways, music, and the unique Creole Gullah language, spoken nowhere in the world, similar to some other languages, Creole in Sierra Leone, some languages in the Caribbean like Jamaican Patois, but it is a unique language, the only African and English-based Creole language that is still spoken in the United States. And it comes into creation because you have Africans from different societies needing to talk to each other on the plantation as well as communicate with Europeans. And so they developed an entirely new language that survives until this day. So you have a landscape that's completely transformed by the presence of the Gullah Geechee people, not just the topography of it, but by the presence of these cultural expressions. If you see on the far left, you see a woman using what we call a fanner basket, which is a sweetgrass basket. It's what they were originally farm tools. They still make them in Sierra Leone, using it to separate the grain from the hull. And that tradition gets kept alive. And so if you've been to Charleston, you've been to Savannah, you've been down to the islands, you will have encountered women weaving sweetgrass baskets. That's an example of an African cultural continuity that survives into the 21st century. So those are the big picture stories that we want to tell. That's why you get 12,000 square miles designated as this unique cultural landscape. But 12,000 square miles, that's a lot of our country. It's a lot of our coastline. And so we know there are real differences in the stories that people want to tell and the local stories that can be told. And of the way that we do the work, the way that we figure out what are the opportunities for stellar storytelling, is I convene quarterly meetings in each state in the corridor. And this was the last in-person meeting we were able to have in North Carolina. It was last summer at the Poplar Grove Plantation outside of Wilmington. Jessica joined us. You could see many other community members there with us. And that's how we start to fill in the gaps. That's how we start to figure out what are the projects that community members like Mr. Beatty you see over on the left-hand side, what are the stories they want to tell and they want to champion? It also gives us a chance to spend time at places like Poplar Grove, who are invested in broadening their interpretive work to account for the Gullah Geechee experience on their site. And year-round, we engage in these efforts. So there are oral history panels where people come in and share specific stories. We fellowship at churches and just get to know people. We go out to the cemeteries, which are important places where history resides. And we start to get a sense of what's the story, the Gullah Geechee story that's rooted in these particular landscapes that we want to share and tell. This is my favorite one we talk about a lot, because if you're not from North Carolina, This is a story you don't know. Normally I would ask people if they know what this is, but since everyone's muted, I will go ahead and share that peanut agriculture is a story that we haven't often told, right? We talk a lot about rice and Sea Island cotton and indigo, but as we spend time in North Carolina, we've learned that there are other forms of agriculture that form part of the Gullah Geechee experience here, and that's a story we want to interpret. Yes, many Americans don't realize that peanuts are grown underground, how they're grown, but there are also important stories about why they were grown, and about the enslaved Africans who grew them, right? Peanuts, widely known in West Africa, have been part of the foodways for a long time, and so this was not an unknown crop to them. They knew how to grow it, as well as how to use it. So peanut farming, blueberries, something else we've learned that we need to talk about. This is another one of Mr. Hayes' painting. So when we come into the community, although we have some set primary interpretive themes, such as I shared earlier, there also, we know we have to be flexible and make way and account for some of these local stories. So this is just an example of some of the different projects that have been brought to our attention. Of course, Reeves Chapel on there. There's been an effort to initiate a rice festival. I don't know if Mr. Willis is with us today, but we have folks interested in a bike trail that connects some of these sites. The Beatty brothers are on. They've been championing the Cedar Hill African American Heritage Festival. Of course, Reeves Chapel on here at the top of the list. Jessica's been part of those conversations. North Carolina has a spectacular story to tell about the experience of Gullah Geechee and African American people during the civil rights movement, right? Some of the earliest sit-ins in North Carolina. Doesn't get nearly the same attention as the sites in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia. So we're working with the U.S. National Park Service, which has created an African American Civil Rights Network, working with them and the African American Heritage Commission to get more recognition for those contributions. And of course, cemeteries, an important part of that work also. I've listed also at the bottom just a few of the different collaborators on here. Of course, this omits all the many community members like the Beatty brothers who are with us today, who are helping to push this project forward, but this work only gets done in collaboration with a broad range of partners. So I wanted to share some of those with you. And the photo on the left, in case you all are wondering, one of the projects in the Cedar Hill African American Heritage Project that the Beatty brothers are working on is to reconstruct a juke joint. So juke joints are and were a part of Gullah Geechee culture, not often talked about. They existed in our communities in North Carolina. It's a story community members want to tell about these places as not just places for people to socialize, but some cases they were very important economic drivers in the community. And one thing that we've learned from the Beatty brothers is that many of them were also run by women because men were doing other things. So a lot of interesting stories to be told there. And this is a picture of a juke joint that still stands in Brunswick County called The Spot, which one of our collaborators, Jim McKee, from the state of North Carolina, called to our attention during one of our planning calls. So it's a for us, a great piece of documentation, but also an important reference work for some of the preservation and reconstruction work that community members want to do in other parts of the county. So I think I did it, and I'm at the 20-minute mark, so I'll stop there. If you want to know more about our work, I put our website up, and we can, of course, send the link around, as well as my contact details. We posted yesterday a guide to places, Gullah Geechee heritage and historic sites that are open now despite COVID. So if you are going to be traveling across the corridor and you want to visit some of these sites, there's a list and guide there. As well as we did a tremendous amount of virtual programming over the summer because of COVID. So if you go to our events calendar, you'll actually find recordings from some of those cultural and historic programs. So we encourage you to check out the website. Thank you. I don't think I've ever talked so fast in my in my life, and normally this is an hour-long presentation, and we have many more stories to tell. But hopefully that gives you, I'll open up the chat, gives you some sense of what we were charged by Congress with doing, how we partner locally, how we get information about projects. And I'm glad the Beatty brothers are here as representatives of community members that are engaging with us to do this work. And I see Mr. Willis, Mayor Willis from Navassa just joined us. For maybe one of the original Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor commissioners, definitely been around this project for a long time. So I'm glad that he could join us today also. And I don't know, man, how y'all want to do Q&A? Or should I check the questions, or do people just want to unmute people?
Yeah, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, go ahead and unmute and you can ask Heather, or you can put it in the chat and Laura will catch it and she will read it for us. Andrew, I see you have your hand raised. Did you have a question or?
No, I was just clapping.
Okay.
It's like, Mr. Beatty?
I don't have a question, I have a comment. Heather, thank you for mentioning the peanuts in West Africa. I grew up right here in Brunswick County, and my grandmother never saw a peanut. She saw ground peas. And when you go to Ghana or the west coast of Africa, they all call them ground peas, and one of their favorite delicacies is ground pea soup. So peanuts are one of the favorites.
Yep. And then North Carolina is a great place to tell that story, not just that part of the story, but many Americans. We consume a lot of peanuts in this country. Most Americans have no understanding of how peanuts are grown, how rice is grown. So these agricultural stories are important to our national story. These Gullah Geechee historic and heritage sites provide a great opportunity to tell them and to make sure that the African contributions get counted, because it's our contention that there were three major cultures that formed the foundation for the South: the Europeans, the Native Americans, and the Africans. And the Africans don't get nearly enough credit for their contributions to what became these very successful, profitable British colonies, right? South Carolina, North Carolina, among the most profitable British colonies in the world. And in the British Empire, and a large part of that was due to this day the still uncalculated economic, intellectual contributions of Africans and their descendants, Gullah Geechee people.
Great. Well, it does look like we have some questions coming in the chat. Heather, this is from Royster and Catherine. What is your favorite element of the Gullah Geechee corridor?
A favorite what? I'm sorry?
Favorite element to the Gullah Geechee corridor?
The people. It's critical to the project. If you talk about the landscapes, for me, I think we don't spend enough time talking about our marshes. All right, a lot of people come to the coast to go to the ocean and to go to the islands, but those marshes are an important part of the story, and a lot of the Gullah Geechee story runs through those marshes. So the two, I spend a lot of time, as you can tell, in the marshes. They're an important platform for storytelling. So both the people who carry all of these wonderful cultural retentions, all this history, like Mr. Beatty just shared, and the wetlands environments, which I think are important. We didn't talk about the conservation part of the work, or the part of our work that touches on resiliency and sea rise and some of those challenges, but that's also part of the advocacy, because Gullah Geechee people have been on the coast for hundreds of years and have been great stewards of the environment, and have important role to play in shaping what's going to be our public policy in response to some of these climate changes.
Great. Thank you, Heather. That actually feeds into another question. What is an example of a success story in preservation?
So one of the one I was talking to them today, one of my favorites is the historic Harrington School on St. Simon's Island, which is one I shared with the Beatty brothers because they have a Rosenwald school that's part of the sites that they're trying to maintain. The Harrington School was a freedmen's school that was built in the late 19th century down on St. Simon's Island. And when Gullah Geechee kids got mainstreamed into mainland schools, in white schools, some of these schoolhouses were abandoned. So by the 1970s, this schoolhouse had fallen into complete repair. And so a group of community members came together with the St. Simon's African American Historic Coalition to preserve it. It was a 15-year project, but it's done now. And it now serves as a museum and a cultural center. And if you visit it, many of the volunteers, it's almost all volunteer run, are former students of the school because it was until the 40s and 50s an active schoolhouse. So you can go down and visit this one-room schoolhouse, had the wood-burning oven in the corner, as well as talk to some of the community members who actually attended that school. And it still sits in what was a Gullah Geechee community. St. Simon's Island, like a lot of our sea islands, been developed. But it's a great example of the sort of preservation that we want to encourage that's completely community-based and results in these great platforms for not just preservation, but then the interpretive work that can be done. And from that base, they also do a music festival that's been running for about 40 years, the Georgia Sea Island Days Festival. And last year added on a Gullah food festival called Taste of Gullah. So from this one preservation project, all of these other sorts of projects have flowed. And so I think it's a great example, one, because of what's possible, two, but shows how hard these projects are. 15 years is a long time, but that's not unusual, but it also gives our community members sort of a understanding of the level of commitment that's involved when you undertake these big historic preservation projects of entire, like Reeves Chapel, of entire buildings. They are long-term projects.
Wow, that must be really rewarding. What an amazing project.
It is, and they're open now. They just reopened last week. So if you happen to be down near St. Simon's or know people on the coast, that is one that they'll take you in groups of 10, and you can visit now. But if you visit our website, on the home screen, you'll see the guide, places to visit this fall safely. Lots of other projects like that. The Pinpoint Heritage Museum. Pinpoint was an oystering community, fishing community outside of Savannah on the river, and the community members worked with preservationists to turn the old cannery into a community museum. So you can sort of step back in time, step into this cannery, but they've also done a great job of sharing not just the fishing story, but of telling a larger community story. So one of the exhibits is toys that they made in the Depression, right? When there was just not a lot. So it's a really great, so that guide will have lots of examples of sites like that, as well as places like Poplar Grove in North Carolina, plantation sites that are also broadening their interpretation to tell this story.
Heather, if we can, two more questions. There's one here from Chris. With increasing sea level rise, gentrification of coastal areas, and loss of access to the salt marshes, can you speak as to what is being done to preserve some of the traditional craft making and other facets of the culture?
Yeah, what are we doing? So what we've done is we formed internally a committee of commissioners, scientists, and community members to start to figure out what our advocacy is in that area. So I guess a concrete example, and one Chris, and Chris is a friend, that's why I'm waving at him. One of the examples is with the sweetgrass basket makers and access to the natural materials, where there are a couple different challenges there, not all related to climate change. One of the real challenges they face is privatization of a lot of land that used to be public lands. And so they just lost access to places where they would traditionally go to get materials. So that committee is looking at all of those issues and trying to figure out what are direct ways what are the levers that we can and should push to help out artists dealing with that issue. And that includes also not just artists, but access to traditional fishing grounds, landings, other places that are also being lost because of privatization.
And then the last one is, it's a combination because they go together. One, what are some ways that people can get involved to help these efforts? And also, how can you support some of these heritage sites?
Yeah, well, so for folks in North Carolina, we have a group of community members that includes the Beatty brothers and Jess and others that are convening on a regular basis to talk about specific projects. And if you are in North Carolina, and if those types of projects that are being shared and discussed are ones you can support directly, we encourage you to do that. So at the commission, we'll push out a lot of information about these local projects and how you can support them. And it doesn't mean writing a check to us. It can mean reaching out to y'all at the Coastal Land Trust to figure out what the needs are, the real financial needs around the preservation of Reeves Chapel. So if you call us, more than likely, I'm going to connect you back to one of these local projects.
Fantastic. Well, Heather, thanks so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. Laura has put the link to the Gullah Geechee corridor there for you guys, so you can go and check out their website. You can also check out recordings of the other lectures and topics and things that are coming up. We got some great programs coming up, so if this is your first time joining us, I hope it won't be the last. On October 9th, we've got Ted Wilgus, the Senior Coastal Specialist with North Carolina Coastal Federation, who's going to talk about oyster farming. October 16th, Mavis Gregg with the American Forest Foundation is going to speak on heirs property. And then November 6th, one of our board members, Sam Cook with NC State, is going to speak about the College of Natural Resources and provide a brief overview of the management strategies for each of NC State's 10 properties with a focus on Hoffman Forest. There's links there in the chat. If you like the little lunch lectures and you'd like to support more programs like that, there's a link there for you. And I just want to thank everybody for being here today. It's going to be a great weekend for outdoor adventure, so get on out there, explore, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Heather.
Heather.
Take care. Bye. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us, Michelle. I see you down there.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you. Hi,
Sorry to
Chris.
see you.
Nice to have seen you.
Yes, Michelle's one of our new commissioners. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Heather.
Hi, Barnes.
Bye, Mayor Willis.
Hi, Reeves.
Mayor
Jordan,
Willis.
Al Beatty. Bye-bye.
Hello, Camilla.
Everybody, take care. Hey, Royster.
Thanks,
Hey,
everybody.
guys. Good
Hey, guys.
good program.
Yeah, she's
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you. We'll see you guys next week.
Yes.